Welcome to a lesson on machine learning. This is our first one. It's actually going to be a preliminary lesson to make sure that your data is all set up properly for the machine learning model and that you sort of understand the ins and outs in terms of what you're putting into a machine learning model. So let's go to a new Colab notebook, colab.research.google.com. And you should have data that you are working with. For this video, what I'm going to do is go inside of this folder. Okay, do this with me. Click on these files, and then you'll see this sample data option. So click down here, and then we're going to use this California Housing train set. We'll talk about difference between train and test at another time. Right click on the three dots, and then copy the path. Okay, that's cool. So what do we do with that? After we've copied the path, we can close that out for some more space, assign it path inside of quotes, paste it in there, and then we're going to load it up in pandas. So we import pandas as PD, and then we'll df equals pd.read underscore CSV, and we're going to put that path in there. Comma separated value is the type of file, and then let's take a look at this data. This is a famous data set. You can see it's got longitude, latitude, housing median age, total number of rooms. This is my house, 5,612 rooms. Just kidding. Clearly, this is a group of houses. Okay, you could infer that from the data. And we have this median house value at the far right. Now, when you are setting up for machine learning, okay, very important, you have to decide what you are trying to predict. It should be a column, okay? This is what you do with supervised learning. You have all the data here, and the idea of trying to predict this column, let's just say I choose median house value, okay, is that you want to imagine in the real world that here in this particular case with your data, you have that information, and you're going to try to build a mathematical model that fits, the other data to those values. But in the real world, the idea is you want to predict something about the future that you don't know, okay? If this was like 20 years ago and you were predicting house values, you have $1 billion company on your hands, okay? This could happen sometimes, runtime disconnected, not sure why. Don't worry about that when it does. You can see it'll try to reconnect up here. Now, just to let you know, in the predictions, there's not a right or wrong. Maybe you want to predict something like the total number of bedrooms. Okay, that's interesting, right? You could have some fun with that. But the reality is if you go inside of a house, you can just get that information. Okay, it's not necessarily something that would be, it's only so interesting to predict. Okay, but whereas predicting what a house will sell for is actually, again, there are companies that have made fortunes on doing that via machine learning. Okay, so that is, in this data set, that's commonly what you or trying to predict. There's not a right or wrong. Just think, is it interesting? That's good enough. Is it useful? Even better. And finally, just to repeat, you have all the data here, but you are imagining a world, a future in which you would not have one of these columns, and it would be useful to try to predict it. Okay, so let's start by doing that. Right, so we do need a preliminary, okay? And I'm going to go ahead and put this in a text cell because it's so important. Make sure data is ML for machine learning ready. And what do we need to do that? Sometimes if you add additional information, so this is a header, you could sort of like even add another text header, or you could simply write it underneath here. How about this? You need two things, okay? This is crucial, all right? And what are those two things? We could even give them little numbers if we want. Number one, okay, data must have no null values, otherwise it will not work. And number two, all columns must be numeric. If you have that, you're good to go. Okay, you press Shift Enter to run your text cells just like your coding one. And okay, this looks good. I'll also go ahead and fix this. So we're going to call this Linear Regression, California Housing. Okay, so I've got sort of the ML model we're going to use and the data set up here. Okay, so we'll keep with this notebook. Okay, so number one, how do I confirm that there are no null values? I like to use df.info because it gives you 1 and 2 often. Okay, so how does this work, right? Well, it tells me there are 17,000 rows, and look at the non-null counts they're given to you. It says 17,000 non-null for each column. Clearly, there are no null values, right? Secondly, all of the data types are floats. You just need something numerical. If you see object, that is no good. Okay, so if you have these two pieces, this data set does, no null values and all numeric, you are ready for machine learning. Just to reiterate, if one of those is not the case, the models will often not work. Okay, so one of the most common errors, my model didn't work, go back and check, are there null values, or do you have columns that are not numeric? Okay, if that is the case for you right now, I have previous videos that discuss this. I'll try to link one below as well. Okay, so we're good to go here. Now what? So what we want to do, let's do our next step here. We're going to establish X and Y. Okay, and we'll say what these are underneath. So first of all, Y is what you are trying to predict. Okay, and this should be a column. And we already said here, we're going to use df, the classic median house value. Okay, and let's check it. So after you define it, check that it is what you think. Okay, and you can see this looks right, median house values. Okay, this is also, by the way, the output of your machine learning model. I'll make another note well, sort of. I mean, it's the output is, well, we'll get into the nuances of that later. Now, what about X? Okay, so X is the input of your model. You know, it's usually all other columns. Okay, it's every other relevant column. You should delete columns that you would not know in the future. Okay, you know, sometimes I do this bike rentals data set, and it's got like the number of, you're trying to predict how many people are like renting bikes in the future. And they give you like the registered number of users and the casual number of users. And combined, they give you the total number of users. And so like, if you're trying to predict the total number of users, you shouldn't already know the registered and the casual because that gives you the result, okay? My point here is you really want to think about it. Okay, now in this particular case, let's look at the other columns. You know, these are things that presumably you would know if you were trying to predict the median house value. Okay, this is not meant to be a deep dive into data analytics, simply quick preliminaries to set up that, yes, we want everything else for our machine learning model. So here's code for everything else but the last column. It's df.indexLocation, iloc, and then in brackets, I'm going to take all the rows, that's first, comma. Now I start with the 0th column, okay, that's there by default, go all the way up to and excluding the last one. Okay, that is, and let's check it. This is basically all columns except last. Okay, if you're not trying to predict your last column, you should have a different potentially lock or iloc. Okay, and so let's just check this. Okay, we've got our X, and we can see. Okay, we've got all these beginning columns. Let's check the end. Median income, but there is no median house value. So this is great. This is exactly what you want. So the whole idea of this prep here is that you need to establish your X and Y. Capital X is not an accident here. That means multiple columns. Lowercase y is not an accident. That means individual column. Okay? So the X and Y look good for this. Once you have X and Y clearly established, the next thing is to build out or start building out your machine learning model.